They cast her out on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, when even wolves feared the dark. Mara Holloway stood before the Ironwood pack in the first snowfall of December, barefoot on frozen ground, while 300 wolves watched in silence. The Rocky Mountains rose behind her like iron teeth against a bruised sky. Montana winters were unforgiving, but the cold in Alpha Garrett Stone's eyes was colder still. He stood on the stone dais where proclamations were made, where pack law became absolute. Tall, dark-haired, with the brutal beauty of all alphas, he looked at Mara the way men look at broken tools, at things that have outlived their usefulness. The wolfless do not belong among wolves. His voice carried across the clearing, without effort, without emotion. Alpha Command rippled beneath the words, a subsonic pressure that made every wolf in the pack lower their eyes involuntarily. Mara felt it too, but differently, like distant thunder, like a storm happening to someone else. She had no wolf, she couldn't shift, and that made her immune to the one weapon Garrett Stone relied on above all others. By pack law and ancient tradition, I sever you from Ironwood. You are no longer pack. You are no longer kin. You carry no scent, no protection, no right to our territory. Mara didn't scream. She'd stopped screaming months ago when the beatings taught her that silence was safer than sound. She stood in the snow, clutching the only thing she'd been allowed to keep, a wooden bowl, cracked down the center, her mother's last gift. The bowl was old oak, carved 22 years ago by hands that had loved her before the world decided she was broken. Grace Holloway had carved it the year Mara was born, worked the wood with such care that even now, decades later, it still smelled faintly of cedar oil. The crack ran from rim to base, a hairline fracture that should have split the bowl in half years ago, but somehow never did. Broken, but still holding its shape, just like Mara. Behind her, the pack began to howl, not in mourning, in celebration. The sound rose into the frozen air, 300 voices rejoicing that the contamination was being removed, that the cursed thing was finally being cast out. Mara turned her back on them, on Garrett Stone, on the only home she'd ever known. She walked toward the tree line where the Thorn Peak wilderness began, where the civilized world ended, and death waited with infinite patience. She didn't look back. The forest swallowed her in less than a minute. The Thorn Peak had a smell. It wasn't the clean pine of the northern forest, the kind that filled your lungs with sharp clarity and made you feel alive. It wasn't the earthy loam of wolf territory, rich with the scent of prey and growing things. It was something older. Wet stone and rotting bark and a faint metallic tang, like blood that had seeped into the soil centuries ago and never fully dried. Mara breathed it in as she stumbled through the undergrowth, her bare feet leaving dark prints in the frost-hardened mud. 3 days since her exile, 3 days since Alpha Garrett had spoken the words of severance, the formal banishment that stripped her of pack scent, of communal protection, of the invisible tether that bound every wolf to their people. Not that it mattered. She'd never had a wolf to begin with. Wolfless. The word had been her identity since the age of 12, when every pup in the Ironwood pack shifted for the first time beneath the harvest moon, and Mara had simply stood there. Bones unmoving, skin unbroken, human in a sea of fur and fangs, while the pack watched in horrified silence. Her mother had held her that night, rocking her like an infant. "It will come," Grace had whispered. "Your wolf is just sleeping, sweet girl. She'll come." She never came, and now her mother was dead, taken by a fever 2 winters ago, and Mara was utterly, devastatingly alone. The cold was the worst part. -20 degrees, and her feet were already gray at the toes, the kind of gray that meant frostbite was measuring her in hours, not days. She'd wrapped her hands in strips torn from her shirt, but it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. On the 4th morning, when her vision had begun to blur at the edges, and her legs moved more from muscle memory than conscious will, she found the cabin. It sat in a clearing ringed by birch trees so white they looked like bones planted in the earth. The structure itself was small and crooked, its roof sagging under moss, its single window dark as an empty eye socket. A failed hunter's outpost, maybe. Or a hermit's grave. It didn't matter. It had walls. It had a door that closed. Mara collapsed inside the cracked wooden bowl still clutched against her chest like a talisman. The interior was a single room, maybe 12 feet by 12, with a stone hearth that hadn't seen fire in years, and a floor covered in dead leaves and animal droppings. In one corner, wedged between 2 floorboards, she found a piece of flint. In another, a rusted knife blade with no handle. She built a fire from dead branches, her hands shaking so badly it took 9 attempts before the spark finally caught. When the flames rose thin and reluctant, she sat before them and let the heat crawl into her chest, where something colder than winter had settled. Grief. The shape of it was familiar now, a dull, constant pressure behind her sternum, like a fist pressing inward. She'd grieved her mother, she'd grieved her wolf, the phantom limb she'd never had. Now she grieved the last fragile illusion she'd held on to, that perhaps despite everything she still belonged somewhere. She didn't. Mara lay on the cold floor and listened to the thorn peak breathe around her, the creak of ancient trees, the distant cry of an owl, the soft percussion of snow hitting the roof. Somewhere out there, creatures with sharper teeth and keener instincts hunted in the dark. She was prey now, unprotected, unscented, invisible to the world that had raised her. Sleep came in thin, restless layers. She dreamed of silver eyes watching her from between black trees. She dreamed of hands reaching for her, enormous and warm. She dreamed of a voice deep and unfamiliar and aching, calling a name she couldn't quite hear. She woke to silence and the faint gray light of dawn filtering through the broken window. Outside, the snow had stopped. The clearing was still and white and untouched. And for one disorienting moment, Mara felt as though she were the last living thing on Earth. On the fifth day, she set her first snare. It was crude work, nothing like the elegant traps the ironwood hunters used, but Mara had spent her whole life watching from the margins. She'd seen how the wolves worked, how they read tracks in the mud, how they identified game trails by the pattern of broken twigs and scattered scat. She couldn't smell prey the way they could. She couldn't hear a rabbit's heartbeat from 50 yards away. But she could watch, she could learn, and she could be patient. The snare was made from stripped bark twisted into rough cordage and tied between two saplings near a cluster of berry bushes. The kind of place a hungry animal might forage in winter when food was scarce. She checked it at dusk. Empty. She checked it again at dawn on the sixth day. Still empty. On the seventh day there was a rabbit, small, scrawny, half-starved itself but alive, struggling against the bark noose with the frantic energy of a creature that knew it was going to die. Mara killed it quickly. She'd seen the pack hunters do it 100 times, one sharp twist, the neck snapping clean. She didn't have their strength, so it took longer than it should have. The rabbit thrashed. She whispered apologies the whole time. When it finally went still, she carried it back to the cabin and skinned it with the rusted knife blade. Her hands were clumsy. She wasted meat, but she got enough. She cooked it over the fire, the smell of roasting flesh filling the tiny cabin and making her stomach clench with a hunger so fierce it felt like violence. When the meat was done, she pulled it apart with her fingers, let it cool, and placed the first piece in the cracked wooden bowl. Her mother's bowl. She ate slowly, methodically, forcing herself to chew each bite 30 times the way Grace had taught her when she was young. Food was precious. Food was survival. You didn't waste it by eating too fast and making yourself sick. When she finished, she set the bowl on the small shelf above the hearth. The firelight caught the crack running through its center, and for a moment the flaw seemed to glow. Broken but holding, Mara whispered to the empty room, just like me. She slept that night with a full stomach for the first time in a week. On the 8th morning she heard it, a sound so small it barely registered. A thin, reedy cry muffled by distance and snow. Animal, not human. Young, desperate. Mara was on her feet before she'd made the conscious decision to move. She pushed open the cabin door and followed the sound into the tree line, her breath pluming in the frigid air. The cry grew louder as she moved deeper, and beneath it she could hear something else. A rapid, fluttering heartbeat. Impossibly fast, impossibly fragile. She found the pup wedged beneath a fallen log half buried in snow. It was tiny, barely the size of her forearm. Dark fur matted with ice and mud, eyes closed, body trembling so violently it looked like a seizure. When Mara reached for it, she felt the shocking heat of fever radiating through its coat. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, little one." The pup whimpered, a sound so helpless, so utterly without hope, that something in Mara's chest cracked wider. She gathered the pup against her chest and ran. Back through the forest, slipping on ice branches, tearing at her clothes. Back to the cabin where the fire still burned low. She laid the pup before the flames, wrapped it in the only cloth she had, a piece torn from her own shirt, and began rubbing warmth into its limbs with the same desperate tenderness her mother had once shown her. The pup's eyes opened, two dark glassy pools that fixed on Mara's face with an intensity no newborn animal should possess. Then it pressed its nose into her palm and exhaled, and something inside Mara shifted. A hairline crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. She lifted the cracked wooden bowl, filled it with melted snow from the fire's edge, and held it to the pup's trembling mouth. It drank slowly, desperately, and when it finished, it curled into the hollow of her body and slept. Mara didn't move. She sat in that ruined cabin holding a dying creature she had no power to save, and for the first time in years she felt something besides grief. She felt purpose. "I'll call you Ember," she whispered into the pup's dark fur, "because you're a spark in the frozen dark, and I won't let you go out." Ember should have died. Every law of nature and probability said so. A runt pup separated from its mother, half frozen and burning with fever in the deepest part of the thorn peak. His chances were functionally zero. But Mara refused to accept the mathematics of suffering. She'd lived her entire life as something that shouldn't exist, and she recognized the same impossible persistence in this trembling scrap of fur. So she fed him. Every single day it became ritual. She'd wake before dawn, rebuild the fire, and venture into the frozen forest to hunt. She wasn't good at it. She had no wolf's nose to track prey, no supernatural hearing to detect movement beneath the snow. She was human, slow, clumsy, armed with nothing but a sharpened stick in an obstinacy that bordered on the divine. But she learned. Day 12, she caught another rabbit in her snares. Day 18, she dug for frozen roots the kind Grace had taught her were edible if you boiled them long enough. Day 23, she tracked a deer through the snow for 6 hours, reading its path by the compression of hoofprints and the height of disturbed branches, only to lose it at a creek crossing. Day 28, she caught 2 trout through a hole in the ice, using a line made from her own hair and a hook carved from bone. Each morning, she'd cook whatever she'd caught over the fire, let it cool, and tear it into pieces small enough for Ember's mouth. She'd place the food in the cracked wooden bowl, her mother's bowl, her only inheritance, and set it before him like an offering. And each morning, Ember would eat from that bowl with a solemnity that made her chest ache. He grew stronger. Slowly, then suddenly, within a week, the fever broke. Within 2, he was standing on wobbly legs, padding around the cabin with his nose pressed to every surface. By the end of the first month, he was following Mara into the forest, his dark fur standing out against the snow like a moving shadow. But there were things about Ember that didn't make sense. The first strange thing was that he never fully shifted. Wolf pups usually cycled between forms instinctively. In their first weeks, their bones still learning the language of transformation. Human one moment, wolf the next, back and forth until the change became second nature. Ember remained stubbornly lupine. Always fur, always 4 legs, always those dark knowing eyes that tracked Mara's movements with unsettling intelligence. The second strange thing was his size. Pups his age should have been the species of a house cat, maybe 20 pounds at most. But by day 40, Ember was already approaching the dimensions of a young shepherd dog, his paws disproportionately large, his shoulders broadening beneath his coat. When he stood beside Mara, the top of his head reached her hip. The third strange thing, the one that kept Mara awake at night, staring at the cabin ceiling while Ember snored against her ribs, was his scent. She couldn't smell it the way a wolf would. She was wolfless after all. Her senses were human, blunt, limited. But sometimes when Ember pressed close and the firelight caught his fur at a certain angle, she detected something beneath the ordinary wet dog smell, something electric, something that hummed along her nerve endings like a warning. It smelled impossibly like authority, like alpha. She pushed the thought away. It was absurd. Alpha pups were born to royal bloodlines, guarded from birth by entire packs raised in luxury and tradition. They did not appear half dead beneath fallen logs in exile forests. They certainly did not curl up each night in the arms of a wolfless nobody, sighing contentedly as she scratched behind their ears. But the thought persisted, humming beneath her daily routine like a bass note she couldn't quite tune out. Day 60. Spring crept into the thorn peak in increments. First the birdsong, tentative and experimental, as if the birds themselves weren't sure winter had truly released its grip. Then the snowmelt, turning the forest floor into a maze of mud and exposed roots. Then the cautious green of new growth, pushing through the thawing earth with the stubbornness of life, refusing to quit. Mara's cabin, which had felt like a coffin in winter, began to feel like something else. Like a den, like a home. She reinforced the roof with woven branches, learning through trial and error which wood bent without breaking, which knots held under weight. She built a proper hearth from river stones, carrying them one by one from the creek bed until her shoulders ached and her hands were raw. She carved a second bowl, clumsier than her mother's work, lopsided and rough but functional. She set it beside the first on the small shelf above the fire. 2 bowls, 2 lives. The mathematics of survival slowly expanding. Ember watched her work with his head tilted, tail thumping against the floor, those dark eyes holding depths she couldn't fathom. Sometimes when she spoke to him, telling him stories, narrating her thoughts, filling the silence that would otherwise consume her, she swore she saw understanding in his gaze. Not the reflexive attention of a pet, but the focused comprehension of someone who was listening, really listening. "You're a strange one, Ember," she told him one evening as spring rain drummed on the cabin roof and the fire painted them both in amber light. "You know that?" He pressed his nose to her hand and exhaled warm breath across her fingers, and the crack in Mara's heart widened just a little more. Not breaking. Opening. Day 87, late March. The Thorn Peak was alive again. Mara was gutting a fish by Whitefish Creek, her hands steady now with practice when she heard the sound. Not a crack exactly, but a deep, wet restructuring, like green wood bending past its threshold. She spun toward Ember and saw his body convulsing, his spine arching at an angle that should have been agony. His jaws opened in a silent howl. His fur rippled like a lake surface struck by a stone. The shift took 11 seconds. Mara counted because counting was the only thing keeping her upright. The black fur retreated like a tide pulled back into skin that suddenly wasn't fur at all. The bones shortened, thickened, rearranged themselves with wet pops that echoed across the clearing. The massive lupine body compressed and reformed muscle, sliding over new architecture until what had been a wolf was something else entirely. A boy, perhaps 4 years old. Pale skin, black hair that fell in tangles across his forehead. Dark eyes, those same dark eyes blinking up at her with a mixture of confusion and absolute trust. He was naked, shivering, and very obviously not a wild animal. "Mara," he said. His voice was small, rough from disuse but clear. Mara's knees gave. She hit the ground beside him, her hands hovering, afraid to touch, afraid that touching would make this real and real things could be taken away. "How?" Her voice broke. "How do you know my name?" "You told me." The boy said it with the devastating simplicity of a child stating an obvious truth. "You tell me everything. Every night. I listen." She stared at him, every story she'd told Ember during those long winter nights. Her mother, her exile, her grief. He'd understood all of it. "What's your name?" Mara whispered. "Your real name." The boy looked at her with those impossibly old eyes and that impossibly young face and said, "Asher." The world tilted. Mara knew that name. Every wolf in every pack within 100 miles knew that name. Asher Stone, the missing prince. Youngest son of Alpha Garrett Stone of the Ironwood Pack, the pup whose disappearance 3 days after Mara's exile had launched the largest search in pack history. The child whose absence had turned an already ruthless Alpha into something worse. She had been nursing the Alpha's son, feeding him from her mother's bowl, holding him through nightmares, loving him with the full unguarded devotion of a woman who had nothing left to protect. "Does he know?" Mara's voice shook. "Does your father know where you are?" Asher's small face hardened into an expression no 4-year-old should be capable of making. "He threw you away," the boy said. "I don't want to go back to him. You're my family, my real family. I felt it. That's why I came." Soul bond. The words surfaced in Mara's mind from some half-remembered lesson back when she was still young enough to sit at the edge of pack gatherings and listen to the elders tell stories. The rarest and most sacred connection in wolf culture. An innate recognition of destined pack hardwired into the marrow. Impossible to fake or replicate. Wolves could soul bond with anyone. Mates, children, adopted family. When it happened, the pull was absolute, irresistible. A 4-year-old pup had followed that pull through a blizzard across hostile territory and into the arms of a wolfless exile because his soul had recognized what his father's pride could not. Mara pulled Asher against her chest and held him. This impossible, stubborn, royal child who had chosen her. She wept into his dark hair until her ribs ached. He curled into her the same way Ember always had, small and warm, and utterly certain that this was where he was meant to be. Inside the cabin, the cracked bowl sat on the shelf, and in the late afternoon light, the fracture running down its center seemed smaller than before, mended perhaps by the slow accumulation of care. Or maybe Mara's eyes were simply learning to look past the damage. Either way, the bowl held. It held. The confession changed everything and nothing. Asher was still the boy who ate from the cracked bowl every evening, who helped Mara gather firewood, who curled against her side when the night sounds of the Thorn Peak grew too loud. But now she knew what he'd sacrificed to be there. On the 88th morning, Mara woke to find Asher sitting cross-legged by the cold hearth, human-formed, staring at his hands. "I remember leaving," he said without preamble. "The night you were exiled, I was in the nursery with my brothers, and I felt something tear, like someone had ripped out part of my chest." Mara sat beside him, close but not touching, waiting. "I didn't understand it then. I was too little. But my wolf knew. She knew you were pack, my real pack. and she couldn't let you go alone. You were 3 years old, Mara said quietly. 3.5. Asher's mouth quirked. Almost 4. You climbed out a window in a blizzard. I shifted. My wolf was stronger than my human body. And the bond was stronger than everything. He looked at her finally, those dark eyes holding a gravity that belonged to someone decades older. I walked for 3 days. I didn't know where I was going. I just followed the pull. It led me to the log, and then to you. Mara's throat tightened. You almost died. But I didn't. Asher reached for her hand, his fingers small and warm. Because you found me. You saved me. That's what Pack does. She pulled him close, this child who understood belonging better than most adults ever would. Your father has been searching for you, Mara said, for 87 days. He thinks you're dead or taken or lost. He doesn't know. He threw you away. Asher's voice went hard. He called you broken. He sent you out to deep. Why would I want to go back to someone who could do that? Because he's your father, because he loves you. He loves what he thinks I should be, an alpha prince, a perfect heir, but he doesn't know me. Asher pulled back, met her eyes. You know me. You've seen me at my worst, sick and weak and scared, and you still wanted me. The truth of it settled between them like fresh snow, quiet, undeniable. If they find us, Mara said carefully, they'll take you back. Pack law says a pup belongs to his birth family until he's of age. Then we make sure they don't find us. Asher's jaw set with an alpha's stubbornness. We stay hidden. We stay together. That's what matters. Mara looked at the cracked bowl on the shelf, at the 2 lives it represented, and wondered how long borrowed peace could last before the world remembered what it had thrown away. Month 4 began with a lesson in fire. You have to learn human skills, Mara told Asher as they knelt beside a careful arrangement of kindling. Shifting is a gift. But what happens if you're injured, if your wolf is too exhausted to emerge? Then I freeze to death, Asher suggested, a hint of humor in his voice. Then you build a fire with human hands and human patience. Mara demonstrated the flint strike, the angle of the spark, the breath that fed flame without smothering it. Your wolf makes you strong, but your human side makes you adaptable. Asher watched with fierce concentration. On his 3rd attempt, he got smoke. On his 7th, a flame. By his 15th, he could start a fire faster than Mara. Alpha intelligence, she muttered. Of course. They fell into a rhythm as spring deepened into early summer. Mornings were for hunting. Mara taught Asher to track without a wolf's nose, reading the forest through broken branches and disturbed earth, teaching him to think like prey so he could predict where they'd hide. Look at the moss, she said on day 95, crouched beside a rotting log, thicker on the north side. If you're lost, the moss tells you direction. What if I shift and just smell my way home? What if you can't shift? What if you're trapped in human form? Mara tapped his forehead gently. Your strongest muscle is here, not in your jaws or your legs. Here. Asher absorbed it all with the focused intensity of someone who understood that knowledge was survival. Afternoons were for crafting. Mara showed him how to weave baskets from willow branches, how to carve spoons from green wood, how to repair the cabin's roof with pitch and patience. Her hands had grown strong over the months, calloused and capable in ways they'd never been in the Ironwood pack. Why did they exile you? Asher asked one afternoon as they worked side by side, his small hands clumsy but determined as he tried to copy her basket-weaving pattern. Mara's fingers stilled. I told you, I'm wolfless. But why does that matter? The pack believes wolfless are cursed, that we weaken the bloodline, contaminate the magic that makes wolves strong. That's stupid. A surprised laugh escaped Mara's throat. Yes, it is. You're stronger than most of them. Asher's voice was matter-of-fact. You survived out here alone. They wouldn't last a week. Strength comes in different forms, Mara said quietly. I'm learning that. Evenings were for stories and the feeding ritual that had become sacred to them both. No matter what, Mara caught rabbit, fish, grouse, venison from the deer she'd finally tracked successfully on day 107. She cooked it carefully, let it cool, and placed it in the cracked wooden bowl. And no matter how many times Asher offered to eat from the second bowl, the one Mara had carved, he always chose his mother's. This bowl saved my life, he said simply when she asked why. I want to honor it. So they sat together each evening, Asher eating from the cracked bowl, while Mara ate from her own rough work, and she told him stories. About Grace, who had taught her that healing came from the earth if you knew where to look. About the Ironwood pack before everything went wrong, when Mara was small enough to still believe belonging was possible. About the world beyond the Thorn Peak, the human towns and wild places where wolves and humans coexisted in uneasy peace. "Do you miss them?" Asher asked one night, firelight dancing across his young face. The pack. "I miss the idea of them," Mara said. "I miss what I thought they were, before I understood what they actually were." "What's the difference?" "I thought they were family. Turns out they were just people who happened to share the same territory." She looked at him. "But you're family, not because of blood or proximity, because you chose to be." Asher reached for her hand. "I'll always choose you." The crack in Mara's heart widened a little more. Room for hope. Room for this impossible child who'd walked through a blizzard to find her. Month 5 brought questions Mara wasn't ready to answer. Day 119. Asher sat on the cabin steps watching Mara work in the small herb garden she'd started and asked, "What was my father like before everything?" Mara's hands stilled in the dirt. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I don't remember him clearly. Just pieces. His voice when he was angry. The way everyone got quiet when he walked into a room." Asher pulled his knees to his chest. "Was he always like that?" "I don't know." Mara sat back on her heels. "I was never important enough to see him up close. But I saw how the pack reacted to him. Fear, mostly. Respect that looked a lot like fear." "Do you think he's looking for me?" The question hung in the air between them. "Yes," Mara said finally. "Whatever else he is, he's your father. He's looking. Will he find us?" "Not if we're careful." But Mara had started noticing things. Small things. Distant howls that sounded too organized to be wild wolves. Trees marked with claw signs at the edge of the territory closer than they'd been a month ago. The prickling sensation of being watched that she couldn't quite shake. The Ironwood pack was expanding its patrols, slowly, methodically. And the Thorn Peak, for all its reputation as a death trap, wouldn't stay forgotten forever. On day 125, Asher asked the question that had been building for weeks. If they make you choose between me and your freedom, what would you pick?" They were by the creek, Asher practicing his shifts while Mara cleaned fish. He'd gotten fast at the transformation. 3 seconds from human to wolf, 5 seconds back. The kind of fluidity that took most young wolves months to achieve. Mara set down her knife. "You," she said without hesitation. "Always you. Even if it means going back to them, to the pack that exiled you." Even then. Asher's eyes filled with tears, the first she'd seen since his shift. He was still so young, carrying burdens no child should have to carry. Mara pulled him close, fish blood and all, and held him while he cried. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered against her shoulder. "You won't. That's not how soul bonds work. We're pack now. Really pack. Nothing can break that." But even as she said it, Mara wondered if she was lying. If love was ever enough to stand against the weight of tradition and power and pack law. That night, Asher slept fitfully, whimpering in his dreams. Mara stayed awake watching the shadows beyond the cabin window, listening to the forest that had become both sanctuary and prison. Month 6 arrived with the full weight of summer. The Thorn Peak transformed into something almost beautiful. Wildflowers erupted in the clearings. The creek ran high and clear. Birds nested in the cabin's eaves, their songs a constant backdrop to Mara and Asher's days. They planted a garden, small experimental, probably doomed, but Asher insisted on trying. He approached it with the same intensity he brought to everything, studying which plants Mara said were edible, helping her prepare the soil, watering each seedling with careful attention. "Even if we're not here to harvest them," he said, "something will eat them. Deer or rabbits, it won't be wasted." The casual assumption that they might not be there in autumn sat heavy in Mara's chest. But there were good days too. Days when the future felt distant and the present was enough. Day 143. Asher caught his first fish without help, whooping with joy when the trout broke the water's surface. They cooked it together and he insisted Mara eat from the cracked bowl that night, a reversal of their ritual that made her eyes sting with unexpected emotion. Day 156. A thunderstorm rolled through the Thorn Peak with biblical fury, and they huddled in the cabin while lightning turned night into fractured day. Asher shifted to wolf form and pressed against Mara's side, seeking comfort, and she told him every story she could remember until the storm passed. Day 168. Asher shifted in his sleep and woke up human, confused and laughing at himself. "I dreamed I was chasing rabbits," he explained. "My body forgot which form I was in." They were building a life, fragile and temporary and probably doomed but real. And then day 173 arrived. Mara heard it first. A howl, distant but distinct, carrying the organized cadence of a patrol rather than a wild hunt. She froze mid-step, her hand tightening around the basket of herbs she'd been gathering. Asher, playing near the creek in wolf form, went instantly still. The howl came again, closer, from the east where Ironwood territory bordered the Thorn Peak. Asher shifted to human and ran to Mara's side. "Patrol," he whispered. "How close?" "2 miles, maybe less." His eyes were wide. "They've never come this deep before." Mara's mind raced. 2 miles meant they had maybe 20 minutes before the patrol reached the cabin, less if they were moving fast. "Inside," she said. "Now, Beham." They ran. Mara grabbed the cracked bowl from its shelf, wrapped it in cloth, and shoved it into a hollow in the cabin wall she'd prepared for exactly this scenario. Asher helped her scatter the herb garden, making it look wild and untended. They covered the fire pit with dirt and dead leaves. "If they find us," Mara said, pulling Asher close, "I'll do the talking. You stay behind me. Don't shift. Don't use your alpha voice. Just be a scared kid. Understand? I am a scared kid." "I know, but you're also an alpha heir, and they'll smell that on you if you give them a reason to look closely." The howl came again, less than a mile now. Mara made a decision. "The birch grove, half a mile north. If they take me, you run there. Hide in wolf form. I'll find you after, I promise. I'm not leaving you." "Asher." "No." His voice carried the edge of alpha command, young and unrefined but unmistakable. "We stay together. That's what you promised." There was no time to argue. The patrol was close enough that Mara could hear individual pawfalls, now the rustle of bodies moving through underbrush. They huddled in the cabin, door closed, barely breathing. The wolves passed within 100 yards. Mara could hear them clearly now, 3, maybe 4 individuals talking in the shorthand of pack-bonded wolves. She couldn't make out words, but the tone was clear. Searching. Systematic. Looking for something. Looking for someone. After what felt like hours but was probably 10 minutes, the sounds faded west. The patrol moving on, following whatever grid pattern they'd been assigned. Asher and Mara didn't move for another 30 minutes. When they finally emerged, the sun was setting, painting the Thorn Peak in shades of amber and blood. "They're getting closer," Asher said quietly. "I know. How long do we have?" Mara looked at the forest that had sheltered them, at the cabin that had become home, at the boy who'd chosen her over everything he'd ever known. "I don't know," she admitted, "but we use whatever time we have left. We live. We make it count." That night, they ate in silence from their respective bowls, the ritual feeling more precious for its fragility. Month 7 brought a kind of desperate joy. They knew they were living on borrowed time, but that made every moment sharper, more vivid. Mara taught Asher everything she could think of. How to identify poisonous plants. How to build shelter from nothing but branches and determination. How to read weather in the color of the sky and the behavior of birds. Day 192, Asher asked, "Do you wish you had a wolf?" They were sitting by the creek, feet dangling in water that was finally warm enough not to hurt. "Sometimes," Mara said honestly, "especially when I watch you shift. It looks like freedom. You're free without it." "Am I?" She smiled, but there was an edge to it. "I'm alone in a forest because I couldn't shift. That doesn't feel like freedom." "You're not alone." Asher leaned against her shoulder. "You have me." "I have you," she agreed, "and that's worth more than any wolf." Day 203. A doe and her fawn appeared at the edge of the clearing. Asher in wolf form went utterly still, watching them with an intensity Mara recognized. Predator instinct. But he didn't move, didn't stalk, just watched until the deer moved on. When he shifted back, Mara asked why he'd let them go. "The fawn was too young," Asher said, "and the mother was nursing. It felt wrong to take her." "That's alpha thinking," Mara said quietly. "Thinking about the future of the territory, not just your immediate hunger." "Is that good?" It's who you are, and yes, it's good." Day 218 brought a moment that would haunt Mara for weeks. They encountered an injured doe near the northern edge of their range. Leg broken, probably from a fall. She was dying slowly, painfully. Predators would take her eventually, but it might be days of suffering first. Asher approached in wolf form. The doe tried to flee, managed 3 agonized steps before collapsing. Then Asher did something Mara had never seen. He used his alpha voice, not on Mara, on the doe. "Be still," he commanded, and the authority in his voice, even in wolf form, was undeniable. The doe stopped struggling, her breathing slowed. She looked at Asher with something like understanding. Asher made the kill quick and clean, merciful. When he shifted back to human, there were tears on his face. "I felt her pain," he said, "through the command. I felt everything, and I knew I could either let her suffer or end it." Mara held him while he cried this boy, who was learning what it meant to have power over life and death. You made the right choice, she told him. The hard choice. That's what alphas do. I don't want to be alpha if it always feels like this. I know, but the world needs alphas who feel it, who understand the weight of what they do. She pulled back, met his eyes. Your father forgot that. Don't you forget it. Asher nodded, solemn and young and carrying more wisdom than any 4-year-old should have to bear. They ate well that night, the doe's meat carefully prepared and divided between the two bowls. The feeding ritual had evolved over the months. Now they blessed the food together, Asher's small voice joining Mara's in thanks for what they'd been given. It felt like family, like pack, like everything Mara had been told she could never have. Month 8 began with a change in the air. Mara felt it the morning of day 235, a thickness to the atmosphere like the pressure before a thunderstorm. The birds were quieter. The forest felt like it was holding its breath. Something's coming, Asher said, echoing her thoughts. I know. They'd had months to prepare, but preparation felt inadequate now that the moment was approaching. Mara checked their escape routes, made sure Asher knew the landmarks that would guide him to safety if they were separated. She wrapped the cracked bowl in layers of cloth and hid it deep in the cabin wall. If we have to run, she told Asher, the bowl stays hidden. We can always come back for it. What if we can't come back? Then we build a new life, make new bowls, but we do it together. Day 238. The patrol passed closer than ever before. Close enough that Mara could smell them, pack scent, organized and purposeful. They were doing a grid search now, systematic and thorough. They were looking for something specific. Day 239. Asher woke from a nightmare screaming. When Mara calmed him, he said he'd dreamed of his father, of Garrett Stone standing in the cabin doorway reaching for him, and Asher not knowing whether to run to him or away. What do you want to do? Mara asked. If he comes, if he finds us. What do you want? Asher was quiet for a long time. I want you to be safe, he said finally. I want him to see what he did wrong. And I want, his voice broke. I want us all to be okay, but I don't think that's possible. I don't either, Mara admitted, but we'll face it together, whatever comes. Day 240 arrived with deceptive calm. Morning broke clear in cold summer's warmth, giving way to the first hint of autumn. Mara woke before dawn and rebuilt the fire, moving through the familiar ritual with hands that trembled slightly. Asher joined her, human form silent. They ate breakfast from their bowls without speaking, both feeling the weight of something inevitable drawing close. I need to check the snares, Mara said finally. I'll come with you. They walked together to the trap line Mara had established over the months. 3 rabbits today, more than they needed. Mara reset the traps while Asher carried their catch. On the way back to the cabin, he stopped suddenly. Do you feel that? He whispered. Mara did. A pressure in her chest, a sense of being watched. How long? She asked. Since we left the cabin. Maybe before. Asher's eyes were wide. He's close, Mara. My father. I can feel him through the bond. The family bond, not the soul bond. He's... A howl split the morning air. Close. Deliberate. A signal, not a hunt. And then from the east, 4 massive black wolves emerged from the tree line. They moved in formation, predatory and purposeful. Each one the size of a small horse, their bodies radiating the controlled menace of apex predators operating at full capacity. As they entered the clearing, the morning light caught their eyes. 4 pairs of molten gold, burning in the shadows like lanterns. The lead wolf was the largest. His shoulders stood higher than Mara's chest. His fur was absolute black, unmarked by any variation, and his aura the palpable crushing weight of an alpha's presence pressed against her like a physical wall. Garrett Stone, 8 months, 240 days, and he'd finally found them. Asher shifted to wolf form, instantly, instinct taking over. He placed himself between Mara and the approaching wolves, small body vibrating with barely contained alpha authority. The 4 wolves stopped at the clearing's edge, and then simultaneously they began to shift. The transformation was violent and elegant in equal measure. Bones cracking and reforming, fur retreating into skin, 4 wolves becoming 4 men in a cascade of controlled metamorphosis. Garrett Stone stood exactly as Mara remembered him, tall, dark-haired, brutally handsome in the way of all alphas. His 3 warriors flanked him, an older man with scarred features who had to be Beta Marcus Wade, and 2 younger wolves, massive and obedient. Garrett's eyes swept the clearing, the rough cabin, the herb garden, the fire pit, and finally settled on Mara, who stood with one hand on Asher's wolf-formed back. Step away from the boy. His voice was low hoarse, vibrating with alpha authority that pressed against Mara's eardrums like a change in altitude. A command designed to make wolves crumble. Mara, who had no wolf, merely felt it as a deep, unpleasant hum. She didn't move. "Step away," Garrett repeated, his voice hardening. "No," Mara said. The word hung in the clearing like a held breath. Behind Garrett, one of the younger warriors actually flinched. Wolfless or not, you did not say no to an alpha's direct command. It wasn't done. It wasn't possible for most wolves. But Mara wasn't most wolves. She wasn't technically any wolf. And that made her immune to the one weapon Garrett Stone relied on above all others. His jaw tightened. "You took my son. Your son came to me." Mara's voice was steady. She'd rehearsed this moment in her nightmares for weeks, and now that it was here, a strange calm settled over her. "He was half dead when I found him. Frozen, burning with fever, alone in a forest you sent me to die in." Mara, Asher shifted to human, naked and unashamed, pressing against her leg. "She saved me." Something fractured in Garrett's face. Mara watched it happen. The microscopic collapse of a man encountering a truth his ego had been shielding him from. His son was alive. His son was healthy. His son was looking at a wolfless exile with more trust and love than he'd ever shown his own father. "Show him," Mara said quietly. "Asher, show him." The boy shifted. It happened faster than it should have for a pup his age. A fluid, almost instantaneous transformation from child to wolf. The black pup that emerged was twice the size he'd been when Mara first found him. Sleek and powerful and radiating an alpha signature that made the three warriors take an involuntary step backward. Asher sat at Mara's feet and howled. The sound was extraordinary. Not the thin, reedy cry of a lost pup, but the deep, resonant call of an alpha declaring his allegiance. It rang through the thorn peak like a bell rattling branches, sending birds erupting from the canopy. The three warriors lowered their eyes involuntarily. Even Garrett Alpha of the Ironwood Lord of the largest pack in the Eastern Territories felt the pull of that howl. Because it wasn't a challenge. It was a declaration. "This is my pack. This woman. This cabin. This cracked bowl that fed me every day while you were hunting for me in all the wrong places. She is mine and I am hers. And no law you've written will change what the soul has already decided." The howl faded, silence rushed back heavy and final. Garrett stood motionless, and Mara watched the Alpha's pride, that immense architectural thing he'd built his entire identity around, crumbling in real time. "He ate from that bowl every day," Mara said. She pointed to the cabin where the cracked wooden bowl sat on its shelf, visible through the open door. "My mother's bowl, the last thing I had. I fed your son from it because it was the only thing of value I possessed, and he deserved the best I could give." She stepped forward. Garrett didn't move. "You call me wolfless," she said, and her voice was quiet now. Quiet the way a river is quiet before it meets the falls. "You call me cursed, empty, unworthy. But I kept your son alive through the worst winter in decades with nothing but my hands and my heart. And every morning he ate from that bowl, and every night he slept safe against my chest, listening to my heartbeat." She was close enough to touch him now, close enough to see the moisture gathering in those golden eyes. "So tell me, Alpha Garrett Stone," she said, "who is really wolfless here?" Garrett's knees hit the ground. The sound was shockingly loud in the clearing. The thud of an immovable object surrendering to an irresistible truth. The warriors stared, shock written across their faces. Beta Marcus's mouth opened and closed, no sound emerging. In the entire history of the Ironwood Pack, no one had ever seen their Alpha kneel. He knelt before a wolfless exile in a clearing in the Thorn Peak, and he wept. "My mother was wolfless," Garrett said, his voice breaking. Mara stopped the confession, catching her off guard. "She didn't shift until she was 19. For 7 years they called her broken. My grandfather wanted to exile her. My grandmother fought for her, hid her, protected her until the wolf finally came." He looked up at Mara, tears tracking down his face. "The night she died, I was 14. She made me promise never let anyone in my pack be treated the way she was treated." "You broke that promise," Mara said quietly. "I broke that promise." Garrett's voice cracked. "The pride. It grows like second skin. You wear the title so long you forget there's a person underneath. Every decision becomes about the pack's strength, the bloodline's purity. And you tell yourself it's duty, it's tradition. But it's just fear," Mara finished. "You were afraid that weakness was contagious. That if you tolerated me, it would make you less." He didn't deny it. Asher knew. 4 years old, and he understood something I've spent decades refusing to see. Strength isn't about the wolf. It's about the heart carrying it. Asher shifted to human and walked to his father. Small, naked, vulnerable. He placed his hand on Garrett's bowed head. I forgive you, the boy said simply, but you have to make it right. Garrett pulled his son into his arms and held him, and Mara turned away from the intimacy of it, giving them space, giving them this moment that was theirs alone. When Garrett finally released Asher, he stood. The alpha mask was gone. In its place was just a man broken and trying to find a way forward. Come back, he said to Mara. Both of you. I'll abolish the exile law. I'll reform the pack. Just please, let me try to make this right. Mara looked at Asher. It's not my choice alone. Asher looked between them. His father who'd thrown Mara away. Mara who'd kept him alive when no one else could. I'll come back, he said finally. But Mara comes as pack. Not exile, not outsider, equal. Garrett nodded. Equal, I swear it. Mara retrieved the cracked bowl from inside the cabin, wrapped it carefully, and placed it in her pack. Everything else, the second bowl, the furs, the tools she left behind. The cabin had served its purpose. The walk back to Ironwood territory would take 3 days, and Mara had no illusions about what waited at the end of it. But she had Asher's hand in hers. She had the cracked bowl against her chest. And she had, for the first time in her life, an alpha who'd knelt before her and admitted he was wrong. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. The journey back took 3 days, and every mile felt like walking through her own grave. Mara insisted on walking. Garrett offered to carry her in wolf form. Marcus suggested a faster route, but she refused it all. If she was going to return to the pack that had exiled her, she'd do it on her own 2 feet, with her head high, with the cracked bowl pressed against her chest and Asher's hand in hers. Garrett walked beside her in human form, keeping a respectful distance. The 2 warriors, Jace and Cole, she'd learned their names, flanked them at a distance. Marcus took point, his scarred face unreadable, his silence somehow louder than words. The first night they camped beside a stream. Mara cooked the rabbit she'd caught that morning, and out of habit placed the food in the crack bowl before offering it to Asher. Garrett watched the ritual with something like hunger in his eyes. You really did feed him every day, he said quietly. 240 days, Mara replied. I counted every one. When why pay it? The question seemed to cost him something. Mara looked at the alpha who'd condemned her to death, who was now asking her to explain why she'd chosen life. Because each day he lived was proof I mattered, she said simply. That I wasn't worthless, that I could do something right. Garrett flinched. I never said you were worthless. You didn't have to. You threw me away. That said everything. Asher ate in silence, watching them both. When he finished, he curled against Mara's side, wolf formed now, a warm weight that had become as necessary as breathing. Garrett stared at them across the fire. He never did that with me, even when he was an infant. He'd sleep in the nursery but never close, always at a distance. Soul bonds don't lie, Mara said. He knew where he belonged before any of us did. I thought I was losing my mind those first weeks after he disappeared. Vivian kept saying maybe he'd been taken, maybe there was a kidnapping, but I knew. I felt it in my bones. He'd left, chosen to leave. Garrett's voice dropped. Do you know what that does to an alpha? To know your own son rejected you? Do you know what it does to a wolfless girl to be rejected by everyone who was supposed to protect her? Mara shot back. We've both been rejected, Alpha. The difference is I didn't have the power to hurt people over it. The fire crackled between them. Marcus, sitting at the edge of the firelight, shifted uncomfortably. You're right, Garrett said finally. And I'm sorry, it's not enough. It'll never be enough. But it's what I have. Mara said nothing. Forgiveness was a country she could see from a distance, but hadn't yet found the road to. What she could offer was something smaller, something more honest. She could sit beside the man who'd destroyed her life and acknowledge that beneath the power and the pride, he was a person in pain. That was all. For now, it had to be enough. The second night brought rain. They sheltered under an overhang of rock, pressed close for warmth. Asher slept between them, his breathing steady and deep. In the darkness, Garrett spoke. 8 months. I searched for 8 months and never looked in Thorn Peak. Why not? Because Thorn Peak is death. No wolf has survived there in 50 years. I told myself if Asher went there, he couldn't finish. I was afraid to go there and find his body, afraid to confirm my worst fear. So I searched everywhere else and called it diligence. Fear is louder than hope sometimes, Mara said. You had every reason to give up, exiled, alone, starving. And you didn't. You chose hope every single day. Garrett's voice was raw. You're braver than I'll ever be. Mara didn't answer. She listened to the rain and held Asher close and wondered if courage was just desperation wearing a different coat. The third day, they reached the border of Ironwood territory. 300 wolves waited in the central clearing. The news had traveled faster than they'd walked. Runners had gone ahead with word that the Alpha was returning with the missing prince and the wolfless girl he'd exiled. By the time Mara, Asher, and Garrett emerged from the forest, the entire pack had gathered. They stood in concentric rings around the stone dais where pack proclamations were made. Mara recognized faces from her childhood. Hunters who'd taught her to track before they realized she'd never shift. Mothers who'd pulled their children away from her when the diagnosis became clear. Elders who'd voted for her exile without hesitation. At the front stood Luna Vivian Stone. She was smaller than Mara remembered, delicate-boned and pale with dark hair pulled back in a severe braid. But when she saw Asher, human form now, walking hand in hand with Mara, her composure shattered completely. She ran, dropped to her knees in the dirt and opened her arms. "Mama!" Asher's voice broke on the word. He ran to her and Vivian caught him and held him and sobbed into his hair with the accumulated grief of 8 months. Every wolf present felt that sound in their sternum. The Luna holding her lost son, the mother made whole. When Vivian looked up, her eyes found Mara's across 30 feet of clearing. "Thank you," she whispered. Then louder so the entire pack could hear, "Thank you." Mara nodded, throat too tight for words. Garrett mounted the stone dais. The pack fell silent. He stood before his people, the same people who had howled in celebration the night of Mara's exile, and for the first time in his reign, he did not project strength. He projected truth. "I was wrong." 2 words. They detonated like quiet bombs. The pack stirred. Murmurs rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. The exile of the wolfless is a practice born from fear, not wisdom. I enforced it because I believed I was protecting this pack. Instead, I drove away the woman who would save my son's life. He turned to Mara, and 300 pairs of eyes followed. Mara Holloway kept Asher alive for 240 days with nothing but her hands in a wooden bowl. She did what 300 wolves could not. She found him because he went to her, because his soul recognized what my pride was too thick to see. His voice hardened with command. "The exile is lifted, not just hers, all of them. Every wolfless exile this pack has thrown away. The practice ends today by Alpha decree, irrevocable and permanent." The reaction was immediate and mixed. Some wolves, mostly the younger ones, looked relieved. Some mothers wiped tears. But the elders shifted uneasily, and Mara saw Marcus's jaw tighten, his hands fisting at his sides. Not everyone was ready to accept this new world Garrett was building. Vivian rose, Asher still in her arms, and walked to where Mara stood at the edge of the dais. The Luna, second in power only to the Alpha himself, extended her hand. "Stay," she said, "not because we deserve you, because Asher deserves his family. All of it." Mara looked at the offered hand. She looked at Asher, who was watching her with those dark, knowing eyes. She looked at the cracked bowl in her pack and thought of her mother, of the woman who had told her again and again that her wolf was just sleeping. She took Vivian's hand. The pack howled. Not in celebration this time, in acknowledgement, in acceptance that was grudging for some, genuine for others, but there. Mara Holloway was pack again. They gave her a cabin at the edge of pack territory where the domesticated world met the wild one. It was larger than the Thorn Peak shelter. 2 rooms instead of 1, with a real hearth and a door that closed properly and windows that still had glass. But Mara stood in the empty space and felt like she was suffocating. "Too much," Vivian said, reading her face. "After 8 months in the wild." "It's fine." "It's not, but you'll adjust." The Luna set down a basket of supplies, blankets, dishes, food. "I packed extra. Asher will probably spend half his nights here instead of the main house. He should be with you, his real family." "You are his real family." Vivian's voice was firm. "The soul bond chose you, and frankly, after what you did, you have more right to him than I do." Mara's throat tightened. "You're his mother." "So are you. We can both be his mothers. That's how pack works when it's done right." Vivian moved to the window, looking out at the forest beyond. "I want to tell you something. When Garrett announced your exile, I begged him not to do it. The night before, I went to his study and I challenged him. I told him your mother had been a healer, a good woman, and casting you out was needless cruelty. What did he say? He silenced me with a look. I retreated, and in the morning you were gone." Vivian turned back, tears in her eyes. 3 days later, so was Asher. And I knew. I knew he'd gone to you, but I was too afraid of Garrett's anger to say it out loud. For 8 months, I let him search everywhere, except where I knew our son actually was. You couldn't have known for certain. I knew. Vivian's voice broke. I'm a mother. I felt the bond between you and Asher even before he was born. When you were both at pack gatherings, he'd reach for you across the room. Just a baby, and he knew. I knew, and I said nothing. Mara crossed to her this woman who'd stood silent while others condemned her and took her hands. You're saying something now. That's what matters. I want to make it right. I want to help you integrate. Vivian's composure cracked. I want to be your friend, if you'll let me. I'd like that, Mara said quietly. They stood together in the empty cabin, two women who'd both been silenced by the same system, and began to build something new. The first month back was harder than Mara had expected. She'd thought the Alpha's decree would be enough, that Garrett's word would reshape the pack overnight. But traditions carved into bone don't dissolve just because someone says they should. Some wolves accepted her immediately. The younger ones mostly who'd grown up hearing about her exile and now saw the injustice clearly. And the mothers who understood viscerally what she'd done for Asher. Others were wary. Their discomfort with the wolfless was too deeply ingrained to dissolve overnight. They nodded politely when Mara passed but didn't meet her eyes. They accepted her presence but didn't welcome it, and a few were hostile. She heard the whispers, saw the way conversations dimmed when she entered a room, felt the weight of judgment from wolves who believed tradition and contamination and the slow erosion of everything that made a pack strong. Mara didn't fight them. She didn't argue or advocate or perform redemption for their benefit. She simply existed, quietly, stubbornly, with the same impossible persistence that had kept her alive in the Thorn Peak. She helped in the pack kitchens, learning the rhythms of communal cooking. She tended the herb garden Vivian showed her, discovering a talent for healing that felt in some unspoken way inherited from Grace. She sat with the pack elders and learned their stories. And she told her own. Slowly, the gap between wolfless and worthy began to narrow. Asher was the bridge. The prince, now formally acknowledged as soul-bonded to Mara, refused to let anyone dismiss her. He developed a habit of shifting to wolf form and positioning himself between Mara and anyone who spoke to her with disrespect, his small body vibrating with barely contained alpha authority. It was, Vivian noted with dry amusement, extremely effective. He gets that from his father, the Luna said one evening, watching Asher growl at a senior warrior who'd muttered something unkind. The stubbornness, the terrifying protective instinct, the absolute certainty that he's right. The difference is, Mara said, Asher usually is right. Vivian laughed, a real laugh, the kind that changed the shape of her face. They were becoming friends. Not because of obligation or politics, but because two women who'd both been silenced had found in each other a voice. Garrett kept his distance. Not out of hostility, Mara could see the effort he was making, the careful dismantling of behaviors that had become structural, but out of respect. He seemed to understand that his presence carried the weight of everything he'd done, and that proximity was a gift Mara had to offer, not a right he could claim. But he was changing the pack. Mara saw it in small ways. He'd begun visiting the exiles, quietly without announcement. He traveled to the territories where the banished had scattered and offered them passage home. Not all came. Some had built lives in their exile and preferred the freedom of solitude to the conditional acceptance of a pack that had once discarded them. But some returned, a trickle at first, then a steady stream. Wolfless men and women returning to the only home they'd known, blinking in the sunlight of the central clearing like prisoners emerging from underground. Mara met each one. She didn't make speeches or promise miracles. She sat with them and listened. And when words felt inadequate, she simply held their hands and let her presence communicate what language could not. I know. I know what it is to be told you are nothing. To believe it. To carry that belief like a stone in your chest until it becomes part of your anatomy. I know. And I survived. And so will you. The cracked bowl still sat on her shelf. She hadn't moved it to the new cabin right away. It felt too fragile for transportation, too sacred for casual handling. But Asher had retrieved it himself, carrying it from the old Thorn Peak cabin in both hands, with the ceremonial gravity of a wolf bearing a relic. He'd placed it on the new shelf beside the lopsided bowl Mara had carved and stepped back to admire the arrangement with evident satisfaction. Two bowls, two lives that had found each other in the wreckage. The fracture in the wood was still visible. It would always be visible. A line running through the center, a reminder that the bowl had nearly broken. But it had held. Through winter and starvation and exile and love, it had held. And now it sat in a warm cabin where firelight could reach it, and the crack looked less like damage and more like a seam. A place where something had been torn and then, through patient attention, had grown back together. Month 4 brought the challenge Mara had been expecting. It came from Marcus Wade the Beta, the scarred wolf who'd stood at Garrett's side for 20 years, who'd helped enforce every exile who believed in tradition the way other wolves believed in breathing. The Pack Council was debating the integration of 3 new returnees, wolfless adults, who'd been exiled a decade ago and were now tentatively coming home. The question on the table: should they be given full pack status or provisional membership? Marcus stood. Alpha, with respect, this sets a dangerous precedent. These wolves were exiled under lawful decree. To simply welcome them back without consequence. There should have been no exile in the first place, Garrett interrupted. Perhaps, but the pack voted for those exiles. The elders agreed. To overturn that now is to say that pack consensus means nothing. That your word alone, my word, is Alpha's law. The chamber went silent. Every wolf felt the weight of command in those words. Marcus's jaw tightened. Then perhaps the pack needs to reconsider what it means to follow an alpha who values sentiment over strength. Mara, sitting at the back of the chamber as an observer, felt the air change. This wasn't just dissent. This was the opening move in something larger. Garrett stood slowly. Are you challenging me, Marcus? I'm asking the pack to remember who we are, what we've always been. Strong because we maintain standards. Pure because we don't dilute our bloodline with the... Finish that sentence, Mara said quietly. Every head turned. She stood moving to the front of the chamber. Finish it, she repeated. Say what you're thinking, that we dilute the bloodline with the broken, the cursed, the worthless. Marcus's eyes were cold. I was going to say the weak. Same thing in your mind, though, isn't it? Mara met his gaze. You called me weak, cursed, a stain on the pack. But I survived what you couldn't: exile, winter, loneliness. I raised an alpha heir you lost. And tonight I stand here while you sit there and pretend your fear is principle. The council chamber was utterly silent. You're not strong, Beta Marcus, Mara continued. You're afraid. Afraid that if we accept the wolfless, it means you were wrong all along. That you exiled innocent people. That you caused suffering for no reason except to make yourself feel superior. She stepped closer. Fear disguised as tradition is the weakest thing of all. Marcus stood. For a moment, Mara thought he might actually attack her, but Garrett was there, moving between them with alpha speed. Enough, Garrett said. Marcus, you've served this pack for 20 years. But if you cannot accept the new order, you're welcome to leave. You'd exile your own beta over a wolfless. I'd remove a beta who undermines pack unity. Your choice. Accept the change or go. Marcus looked around the chamber, looking for allies, for support. But the wolves who might have backed him a month ago now lowered their eyes. They'd seen what Mara had done. They'd watched Asher choose her. They'd heard the stories of 240 days of daily survival. And slowly, achingly, they were beginning to understand that strength came in forms they hadn't recognized. I'll go, Marcus said finally. You're exiled, one of the junior wolves had asked, shocked. No, Garrett said. He's choosing to leave. There's a difference. Marcus held Garrett's gaze for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out of the chamber. 8 other wolves followed him, traditionalists who couldn't accept the new world being built. The pack watched them go in silence. When the door closed, Vivian spoke. We'll be weaker without them, at least in the short term. We'll be stronger, Mara said quietly, because everyone who stays actually wants to be here. That's a kind of strength tradition can't measure. Garrett looked at her, something like gratitude in his eyes. The council voted. 3 wolfless returnees were granted full pack status, unanimous with 9 votes now absent. 6 months after Mara's return on the first snowfall of December, everything changed again. It started with a rogue wolf, not a pack wolf, a feral wolf who'd been exiled from another territory and gone mad in the isolation. They appeared in the pack lands without warning, massive and scarred, and driven by something beyond reason. The attack happened near the forest edge where pups were playing under the watch of a single adult guardian. 3 pups, including Asher. The guardian was too far away. The rogue was too fast. Mara was closer. She'd been gathering herbs near the tree line, her mind on the mixture she was preparing for an elder's joint pain. She heard the snarl, the scream, and was running before thought caught up with action. The rogue had Asher cornered against a fallen log. The other 2 pups had scattered, but Asher stood his ground, wolf formed far too small to fight, but refusing to flee. Mara grabbed a fallen branch, thick as her arm, heavy as a weapon, and ran between the rogue and the pups. Get behind me, she screamed. The rogue laughed, a sound that came out as a choking growl. A human trying to speak with wolf jaws. A human thinks she can stop me, he charged. Mara swung the branch with everything she had. It connected with the rogue's skull hard enough to stagger him, but not stop him. His jaws open, yellow teeth dripping saliva reaching for her throat. And something inside Mara exploded. It wasn't thought. It wasn't decision. It was pure incandescent rage. Protective fury. Mother's instinct. The absolute refusal to let this creature harm her child. Heat erupted in her chest, spreading through her limbs like wildfire. Her bones began to crack. Not the gentle restructuring she'd seen in normal shifts. This was violent, agonizing. Her spine arching, her jaw unhinging, her skin rippling as if something underneath was trying to tear free. She screamed, and the scream became a howl. Fur erupted, not black, not brown, white, pure white. The shift took 90 seconds that felt like hours. When it was finished, a white wolf stood where Mara had been, larger than a normal female, eyes silver instead of gold, and radiating an aura that made every wolf in a half-mile radius stop what they were doing and turn toward the source. Alpha, female alpha, something that hadn't existed in 300 years. The rogue froze, staring at her. Impossible, he rasped. White wolves are extinct. Mara Wolf, now instinct roaring through her veins, didn't speak. She attacked. Clumsy because she'd never fought as a wolf, never moved on four legs, never used jaws as a weapon. But fearless, absolutely fearless. The rogue was a trained fighter. But Mara had protective rage and newfound strength and the desperate need to end this threat. They clashed in a blur of fur and fangs. Blood spattered the snow. Some hers, some his. Asher joined the fight, small black wolf biting at the rogue's legs while Mara went for the throat. Together they brought him down. Mara's jaws found the rogue's neck. One bite, one perfect, crushing bite that made him go still. Mercy, he whimpered. She could kill him. Every instinct screamed to finish it. But Asher's voice cut through the rage. Mara, stop. You won. She released, shifted back to human, naked and shaking and covered in blood. Someone threw a cloak over her shoulders. Leave, she told the rogue, her voice raw. If you come near this pack again, I won't show mercy twice. He ran, limping, broken, but alive. Mara collapsed. Asher shifted to human and threw himself into her arms, and she held him, while the pack gathered around them in a circle of shocked faces. Elder Miriam pushed through the crowd. The ancient wolf, 80 years old and white-haired, dropped to her knees beside Mara. White wolf, she breathed. I thought I'd never see one in my lifetime. What does it mean? Vivian asked, appearing at Mara's other side. White wolves are the rarest, Miriam said, tears streaming down her face. Born once every 300 years, they emerge not from bloodline but from will, from hearts that refuse to break despite every reason to shatter. She touched Mara's face gently. Your mother knew. Grace knew. That's why she gave you a cracked bowl. Cracks let the light in, and you, Mara Holloway, are full of light. Garrett approached slowly, reverently, and for the second time since Mara had met him, he knelt. White Alpha, he said, will you lead beside me? Mara looked at the cracked bowl visible through the window of her nearby cabin. The bowl that had held food for 240 days. The bowl that had held her together when everything else fell apart. I will, she said, but I lead for them. She pointed to the wolfless members standing at the edge of the crowd, to the returnees who'd come home after years of exile, to Asher and the other pups who deserved to grow up in a pack that valued hearts over bloodlines. I lead for everyone this pack forgot. The pack howled, not in celebration this time, in recognition, in acceptance of something new being born from the ashes of what was broken. Spring came to Ironwood territory 40 years later. Mara stood at the edge of the forest where the thorn peak began, her white fur bright against the greening trees. Beside her, a massive black wolf, Asher, now grown into the alpha king he was always meant to be. They'd built something together. Not perfect, but real. The Ironwood pack now had 200 integrated wolfless members. They served as healers, scouts, craftspeople, teachers. The pack was stronger for their presence, not weaker. The cracked bowl sat in the pack's central shrine, preserved behind glass. It had become the most sacred relic in pack history. Young wolves brought offerings to it, flowers, carved tokens, prayers written on bark. The bowl that had fed a prince, the bowl that had proven broken things, could still hold everything that mattered. Vivian had become Mara's closest friend and co-leader. Together, they'd reshaped what it meant to be Luna. Not just the alpha's mate, but a voice of wisdom and mercy in her own right. Garrett had lived another 30 years after Mara's shift, long enough to see his son become the greatest alpha in pack history. Long enough to watch the exile law become not just abandoned, but forgotten, a relic of a crueler time. Before he died, he'd taken Mara's hand and said simply, "Thank you for showing me what strength really means." Now Asher led the pack with one law above all others: show up every day for those who need you. And across the territories from pack to pack, the story spread. The story of the wolfless girl who'd survived winter with nothing but a cracked bowl and stubborn love, who'd fed a lost prince 240 days, who'd become the white alpha and reshaped the world. Mara shifted to human, her hair white now, with age, her body still strong. She looked at the forest that had tried to kill her and had instead become her salvation. "Your wolf was never sleeping, Mom," she whispered to the wind. "She was waiting for me to become someone worth waking for." Behind her, the pack gathered for the evening run. 300 wolves plus 50 humans who ran alongside them on two legs. All of them pack. All of them belonging. Asher nuzzled her hand. Ready. Always. They ran together into the twilight, white wolf and black, and the forest rang with the sound of a pack that had finally learned what it meant to be whole. The cracked bowl remained on its shelf in the shrine, and in the fading light, the fracture running down its center seemed to glow. Not a flaw, a feature, not damage, a map of survival. Not broken, never broken, just capable of holding more.